Stupendous. Everyone, thank you so much for your time joining us on Cyber Judo tonight. We have an extra fun session with you guys. We're going to be talking about building a home cybersecurity lab. One of the things that we were just chit-chatting about before the recording started was just there's a lot of articles, there's a lot of guides out there about, hey, you want to set up VirtualBox? This is how you set up VirtualBox step by step by step. Hey, you want to leverage Hyper-V on Windows? Here's how to leverage Hyper-V on Windows step by step by step. Those are fantastic articles, and that content certainly has a place to live. But at the end of the day, I think what's more helpful is to facilitate a conversation about the thought process of architecting a pen testing or a CTI or a forensic analysis lab, right? The options you have that are at your disposal when it comes to hardware, networking solutions, virtualization solutions, the types of virtual machines and the types of software that you can deploy in your lab, what those pieces of software and virtualization solutions do. And then also talking about the different setups that you guys can build that can meet your technical and budgetary needs. So that being said, I got my screen shared open, and what I want to do is just talk at a high level for you guys about the why behind it and why we believe that everyone who is passionate about cybersecurity should really have a home lab. So first and foremost, if anyone wants to follow along, you guys always know that we have our content always hosted on CyberJudo right under the training content video section. And so you should be able to see this building a home cybersecurity lab. If you want to jump ahead, feel free to be my guest, not a problem at all. What I'm going to do is going to kind of walk through it step by step by step. We'll open it up to questions. And then as we kind of go through the process, we'll address some of those questions. So Travis, if you could do me the good favor, sir, of reviewing the Q&A and addressing any questions that we've perhaps already chatted about. And then what we'll do is maybe every couple minutes, stop for a moment and address questions. Cool beans?
You bet.
Okay, awesome. So first and foremost, so I do not say pen testing lab, because everyone's very centric when they think about cybersecurity. They'll think about building a pen testing lab, and pen testing labs are absolutely fantastic and awesome, but there's so much that can be done in the space of cybersecurity, and pen testing is very sexy to folks, right? But at the end of the day, if we only focused on pen testing or red teaming, then we would only be getting half of the insight, half of the picture of really what's going on when we work with cybersecurity in the sense of what's happening on the blue team side, right? How can we improve our defensive measures, right? What's happening from a threat intelligence standpoint when a malicious actor gains access to a set of systems or network infrastructure and trying to investigate that. When it comes to building infrastructure for empowering the blue team and the CTI team to detect threat actors and to react to threat actors and to contain threat actors, right? And then also building out a lab for performing things like forensic analysis in the unfortunate scenarios and events where a system is compromised by a malicious actor, right? Imaging that system and then taking a look at it and trying to figure out the who, what, where, why of that particular situation and what's going on so that we can figure out who the actual ATP was behind that particular attack, right? Understand what the potential exposure to adjacent assets or systems is, right? And then try to determine a really good root cause analysis of how do we prevent this from occurring again in the future, right? So that being said, some of those core benefits being that we're doing a lot of hands-on learning. And we're all aware of solutions like Try Hack Me and Hack the Box. And Try Hack Me and Hack the Box, were very centric to originally pen testing, and Try Hack Me has been around for a long time. And Try Hack Me has since expanded their course content and material to a lot of blue teaming stuff, forensic analysis, CTI, all of that. And that's great. And those solutions and services certainly have a place, but they're also limited in regards to the flexibility, right? And the capabilities of them in being able to customize something and make it your own, which can then better simulate real systems, real situations a bit better, as well as allow you to kind of get into the nuts and bolts. And I've always found that the opportunity in which you can best become a quote unquote domain expert in a particular topic is really just jumping right into it and trying to figure it out, and sometimes putting a bit of time into troubleshooting it. And while it can be a little bit painful to kind of troubleshoot it and tease out those details, that's what helps us remember the why behind what we do. not just the following the copycat steps behind something. That being noted, I want to just address one quick question I saw come in. No worries, team. This session is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube probably sometime either tomorrow or on Friday. So thank you guys for that question. So continuing on here. So the hands-on learning, the customization, also cost effectiveness. You can do a lot with building a lab with just a couple bucks, obviously you can scale that out to being an investment of hundreds of dollars or even maybe a couple thousands of dollars off to the side. But what it builds for your expertise, your knowledge, and your skill set will be much greater than even $1,000 or $2,000 investment by far, right? And then obviously career development and preparedness. So preparedness of a lot of times when we work at an organization, at an enterprise, we're interested in playing with new tools, setting up new systems, trying different things out. Sometimes the enterprise has the resources to do that. Sometimes it doesn't. And what I have found being in the areas of technology and cybersecurity is passionate people a lot of times don't want to wait for enterprise approval, right? A lot of times they don't want to wait for resources to appear. They want to just kind of play with something and learn it and see what's on the other side of the fence and see if maybe the other side is a bit, the grass is greener with a particular, let's say, security information event management solution, right? Or they want to try out some, new labs or some new techniques or something like that, right? So I think that's really great in that particular regard. Also career development, even just in the most basic sense of having a resume, right? If someone has a resume and then they're going and conducting interviews, that's something you can talk about, right? When you talk about, hey, yeah, I got a cybersecurity lab and I set this up and, this is how I configured the network and my virtual machines. And these are the things that I've been doing with it. Especially for people who are just breaking into cybersecurity, it communicates a couple different things, which is one, your passion, right? And two, the fact that you are a self-started, motivated individual, right? A lot of people, and this is, again, no offense to any of the fantastic people that are on this call with us, a lot of people will say, hey, I'm top percent of try hack me, right? That's great. And that certainly shows motivation in its own regard. But you're in a whole different class when you could say, I built this lab and look at all these virtual machines and look at all these systems, look at all these things that I did with it, right? And how I configured it out. That certainly is going to help separate you from other folks and differentiate you, especially because I know that this is a particular time where there's a lot of people kind of vying for the same types of positions, So that being noted, there are a couple different types of labs that we can set up. So I already was speaking a little bit about this in regards to, we are all familiar with pen testing labs. You can set up pen testing labs with, obviously a Kali Linux or, Parrot Linux virtual machine, right, that you would use that has your tools on it, right? And then deploy out purposely vulnerable virtual machines that you can leverage and utilize to, hey, with Metasploitable, see if you can run through a set of techniques, get a shell in that system, that kind of stuff, right? Helpful, certainly. There's a lot of them that are kind of fairly standard ones that I'm sure in a couple of moments as we kind of dive into that topic, you guys will be aware of. But you can also make your own vulnerable labs and systems, right? Especially when it comes to, one of the things that I see less and less frequently is there's tons of Linux vulnerable virtual machines, but very, very few, comparatively at least, Windows vulnerable virtual machines. And most enterprises are leveraging Windows fairly heavily with Active Directory. So being able to build out an Active Directory server, right, and purposely make it weak and insecure tells you, one, okay, what the best practices are, invert that, right? And then now see what's the practicality of you being able to exploit that, right? And learn every step of the way and performing lateral movement, right? And also forensic analysis and the CTI components, that threat intelligence of gathering data, collecting information from security information event management solutions, gathering data from the network, being able to look through it, building an elk stack, right? Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, right? To parse large data sets, write an expression, and then graph out the data so that you can see, various patterns and trends that would be indicative of a malicious actor compromising an environment, right? And then also purple teaming, building a purple teaming lab. I had previously did a whole session here on Cyber Judo about purple teaming. and one of my most favorite tools. It's absolutely fantastic. And, I kind of actually feel like a jackass because I didn't write it down below about all the suggested software and solutions. I'm going to have to write it in there like last second here is MITRE Caldera, because MITRE Caldera allows us to deploy out a bunch of simulated workstations and servers and systems that we can then run various TTPs against, right? And what's really cool with the TTPs that we can run against all these virtual machines and servers that we deploy and all that kind of stuff is that the real TTPs using real shell code, real scripts, right? Utilizing the real techniques that are seen by advanced persistent threats out in the wild, right? And then mapping that to the MITRE attack framework, right? So that allows you to then take that information, right, and be able to identify what's the security controls for your defense in depth architecture for your organization or for a set of systems or for another business. And realistically speaking, where there might be certain holes in which an organization can't really effectively identify or contain a malicious actor, right? So that being said, I want to jump right into architecting a lab. Again, there's a lot of guides out there that'll just walk you step by step by step, deploying out Hyper-V or deploying out VirtualBox, right? And they have value, but they don't provide context to what's the value proposition with going with Hyper-V over VirtualBox, right? So some of the major components, we got compute hardware, networking hardware and solutions, virtualization software and hypervisors, the virtual machines that you run on top of that, and the software you would run on top of your virtual machines. Fairly straightforward. We can visualize this as essentially a set of layers with your network infrastructure being underlying, and then some level of compute, maybe some storage with it. I'm not going to get into NASA's or anything like that today, although I do love working with, again, tons of home network solutions. I was like, back in the day, I was one of the first folks that was using FreeNAS. I was a huge FreeNAS guy, right? But on top of your compute infrastructure, virtualization, hypervisor, virtual machines, and software. So this is, by the way, no means absolutely exhaustive, but I think it even serve as a frame of reference for when you're evaluating other solutions that may not be specifically documented in here. It allows you a frame of reference of saying, well, these are the attributes that I should be really considering from a compute standpoint or from a network infrastructure standpoint if I'm trying to obtain equipment. So first and foremost, probably the most popular virtualization platforms out there and hypervisors out there for folks to start leveraging and utilizing is usually VirtualBox number one, because VirtualBox is just easy to use, it's free, and it runs on pretty much any operating system. So it's super straightforward, super entry level. Probably right after that is Microsoft Hyper-V, because, well, most people have a Windows computer. And if you have a Windows 10 or 11 computer, you can basically enable the Hyper-V feature on it, and you can run virtual machines on it. And it's a little bit more complex, but not that much more complex to leverage and utilize. And it's free because it comes bundled with your Windows operating system. But while it will do in a pinch to run a VirtualBox, an instance of VirtualBox or Microsoft Hyper-V on your local desktop or your regular working computer, again, it'll work in a pinch. The CPU locking, the memory consumption, and the lack of network segregation is going to become a bottleneck and will leave a lot to be desired. It'll be a bit frustrating when you encounter a lot of things as being slow and really not having an environment which you feel simulates an enterprise or a small business network, right? So I always like to remind people before they buy or purchase anything that old network equipment, old computers that are lying around, even laptops, all that kind of stuff, they're fantastic for pieces of equipment and devices in your lab. I used to be a really big Cisco guy back in the day, CCNP and routing and switching and wireless and in security. And I would collect like, 2960s, and I collect 3560s, and I collect, old ISR 1800 series and ancient Cisco ASA 5505s, all that kind of stuff. And I love putting them into my lab because they simulated a really set a fairly common set of customers that I would encounter, which is a business that was suffering with technology debt issues, and grab all those up, throw them onto my pen testing VLAN, and see what I could get out of them. And so I would say that if there's ever the opportunity where you see that there's people donating equipment, getting rid of equipment, don't just see that as trash. Even if it has a $0 value to somebody else, right? Or you can pick something off of eBay for $5, $10, $20, right? Certainly do that. It's going to be a useful and helpful experience. Although I will say, a lot of that networking equipment and old computer equipment, the server fans and the little CPU fans, the bearings tend to get worn down, so they get really loud and annoying. That's the worst part of it. Otherwise, if you can put in earplugs, you'll be good. So compute hardware here. So Supermicros, I actually run a couple of Supermicros here. Again, there's obviously a lot of different server providers, that kind of stuff, but they're fairly cheap, inexpensive, small, low power. The ones that I tend to use make very little noise comparatively. Again, you could still pick up a bunch of old HPs, a bunch of old Dell servers if you wanted, that are big rack mounted ones. If you have the space in your garage or whatever, be my guest. Those could still work even if they're like 5, 8 years old, right? You can still run a lot of great virtualization software on them. It'll limp with some of the compatibility issues with maybe like TPM 1.2 and all that, but it'll do. But brand new Supermicro, if you want to pick one up, yeah, that's a fantastic solution if you want to get really serious right from the get-go. If you need something to kind of dip your toes in, Latte Pandas, Udo bolts, those come fairly cheap and inexpensive. Also, the small ThinkCenter tiny desktops. You can get essentially a lot of these devices with like the Latte Pandas. They're a bit smaller. And actually, I think I got one right here. So these are great if you're really like have very little space, to work with. Maybe you're in like an apartment or something like that. You also want something that's like essentially not passive. It's not passively cool, but very close to being passively cool. This is almost absolutely silent, right? Not to mention if you want to go take this somewhere on mobile trips, or maybe you want a little pen testing appliance to leverage and utilize in the future when you go to do on-site pen testing. These are great little devices. So calling that out in that regard. Udo bolts, that's another fantastic solution. We leverage the Udo bolts actually at Gotham Security for our main platform when we have internal network pen testing appliances that we deploy on site to customers. Absolutely fantastic. AMD Ryzen platform. They even have a little AMD Ryzen or a little AMD GPU in them, which makes them fairly powerful for just doing some lightweight hash cracking and whatnot. So pretty cool there. The power footprint of those is very reasonable. Building them is fairly easy, but you got to build them kind of from scratch, right? So you got to get the pieces together and that kind of stuff. I included the Raspberry Pi 4 here because everyone always has something to say about a Raspberry Pi, right? Everyone's like, well, why don't you include the Raspberry Pi? So I don't usually recommend Raspberry Pis in a conventional sense of running virtual machines on them, but you can run tons of other great things on them. You can run you could run Kali Linux directly on them if you wanted to, but you could run a bunch of vulnerable instances of Linux and all that kind of stuff on them. You could even run, by the way, on a Raspberry Pi 4 8 gig, you can run an ARM version of Windows 10 and 11 on them, right? And you could purposely make it vulnerable if you wish. That's not a problem at all. But while you can run something like VMware ESXi, I shit you not, on a Raspberry Pi, I would certainly not recommend it. You will hit a lot of CPU lock issues. And then they're also ARM-based processors, so it's architected a bit differently. So I just want to call that out. Another really important thing to call out is when people first get into forensic analysis and CTI work, and they'll have a lab, what they'll do is they're like, okay, cool. So I'm going to start putting like this like compromised malware-laden virtual machine in the same hypervisor that runs my production payloads, please, or workloads. Please don't do that. Don't do that at all, right? There are things like transient execution CPU vulnerabilities, right? Like Spectre and Meltdown. There have been known instances of cases that malware are able to exploit those vulnerabilities and weaknesses to compromise the underlying hypervisor and adjacent virtual machines. If you're doing forensic analysis on truly compromised systems, image the system and move it over to a virtualization hypervisor that is, for all intents and purposes, air gapped. Okay. Because that virtualization hypervisor in itself could become compromised if there's the right type of malware on there. Just want to call that out. And then obviously, as an initial step, if you're ever doing forensic analysis on something that's malware related and compromised, and you don't want it to be communicating out, like some people like to experiment, like, hey, let's see what happens when I let it communicate outbound. I would not suggest that, no, not unless you want unwarranted activity on your public IP address. But just delete the virtual NICs on the virtual machine. This way, there's not even the off chance that you forgot to turn off the NIC or something like that. So,
if you mind, if I could jump in as well, another thing that I would recommend. So I actually use a Dell Optiplex here for some of mine. And then alternatively, I also have HP Elite Desks. And the reason why I say that these are okay is because they're DDR4 RAM. They got 8 gigs, which isn't a lot, but if you're only running like small Linux machines, it does okay. You can get them for like probably like 120 bucks. So just a side note there. And also, Christian, there was a question in the Q&A about an old Mac Mini. I'm not a Mac guy. Do you find that emulation on a Mac for like an older one, like 2010, do you think it's worth it? What do you think?
Yeah, actually, certainly. I still have an old MacBook lying around that's pretty old like that, because you can still run like VMware Workstation or Parallels on it. And those are Intel x86 processors. So the virtualization on those is fairly easy, nothing too crazy in that particular regard. VirtualBox will also run on those. It's an older Mac, so you're not going to be able to run a ton of things, but I certainly would not throw it away. I think that's a great piece of equipment to work with. Hell, yeah, even just having an old version of Mac OS lying around and trying to break into that device on the network, is certainly worth the opportunity of playing with. So yeah, that's a great question. I would say when it comes to Mac OS, the newer ARM-based Macs, while they're absolutely fantastic with the M1, M2 processors, and they'll be coming out with M3s fairly soon, if not already, but those are not so hot when it comes to virtualization of x86, because obviously it's an ARM-based platform, so you can't do native virtualization. It has to do this quirky emulation. You can virtualize like an ARM version of ARM version of Kali Linux or ARM version of Windows, with probably the best virtualization software for the ARM Macs is UTM. But again, now you're just working with ARM stuff. Most enterprises aren't running a lot of Linux ARM yet, or Windows ARM yet. So it's a little bit different. There are a lot of similarities still nonetheless, but your mileage is going to vary with the M1s and the M2 Macs. They're not great for lab stuff. So networking hardware solutions. Okay. So again, in a pinch, you could use your regular home firewall. But I'm just going to say this. If there's anyone here who's takes cybersecurity seriously and you're using the router modem combo that you got from your internet service provider, then I would advise that you go take a look at the fantastic Cyber Judo session that Dennis did on reverse engineering a ISP provided router that he got and getting a shell in it. And he got in 2 episodes in 2 hours. Okay. Absolutely fantastic content. Never, ever trust the firewall router combo, modem combo device that you get from your internet service provider. It's terrible. This is the worst stuff ever. And even in that case, it actually provides you the opportunity of building out a more secure home network for yourself. I always like to tell people, hey, you're trying to get into cybersecurity, you want to be passionate about cybersecurity, apply it to your own life first. Secure your own life. It makes you feel good about yourself. It's practical. You're putting your skills to use, and then you can help secure your family members and your friends, and you can help educate them, spread that wealth of knowledge, right? So I always advise people, hey, look, there's like 5 main solutions out there. That's not to say it's everything. It's not fully inclusive, right? But there's like 5 ones that I usually turn to when I'm chatting with people about a firewall, network switches, all that kind of stuff to deploy. Ubiquiti, pfSense, OpenSense, Sophos XG Home, and MikroTik. So they all have the pros and cons to them. We can kind of go back and forth and look at the table of the pros and cons. I also provided some suggested entry models that are hyperlinked here, so you guys can click right into it and you can kind of take a gander around at the hardware and whatnot in a nutshell. So first first most here. So pfSense, OpenSense, and Sophos XG, those can all be ran as virtual machines. They can also be ran on pretty much any fairly modern x86 computer. So, you could, I've even ran firewall software like for Sophos XG on an old laptop. It looks weird, but it works. As long as you can have 2 or 3 network interfaces. Obviously, you need to have one for the internet, right? And then at least one downstream to the rest of your local area network. You can do it. So you could, for all intents and purposes, if you had an extra computer laying around, an old desktop computer, let's say, right? You could actually put pfSense on it or OpenSense or Sophos XG, and it would work well, and it'd be free, And pfSense is like the standard when it comes to, like, the de facto when it comes to open source firewall solutions, and feature rich, tons of plugins, great supportive community. The original creator behind pfSense, he turned around and created OpenSense, another project, very, very similar architecture, similar feel as pfSense. There are a couple underlying principles and beliefs that are different with OpenSense. So there's essentially kind of like a different sense of direction they want to kind of take the solution. And then also the UI is a bit different. It's actually a bit easier to use. So again, very similar in that regard. Both pfSense and OpenSense, you can purchase essentially pre-packaged, pre-installed appliances for yourself to make your life a little bit easier. The OpenSense ones are a bit more expensive. You're talking at least like usually $1,300. So that's a bit of an investment. But then the Netgate pfSense, you can get as low as like $130. It's a small little firewall. It's not super powerful, but it certainly would work really well in a lab at least. When it comes to Sophos XG, they do have hardware that you can purchase as well. And again, you can install a virtual machine or you can install on regular x86 computers. Very polished experience, not open source. It's commercial, and you're getting basically a freemium license. But I'll tell you what, if you are somebody who's trying to learn more about how to do networking for small businesses or for enterprises, that's a great step forward to play with that, because they got all the bells and whistles unlocked. Basically, the only limiter is the amount of RAM and CPU cores it'll use, right? So you can get a home license on that fairly easily, play with it, have a good time with it. Again, it's not open source though, and you can get hardware for it, but the hardware is like much more centric to businesses. So, you're talking about an investment that's usually measured like in the thousands of dollars territory there, right? And then MikroTik, super, super inexpensive. You can get little firewalls for like $35, that kind of stuff. They are highly customizable, super feature rich. I mean, if you ever ran BGP on a $35 firewall, I haven't, right? And that's kind of quirky, but apparently you can do it, right? The thing I personally don't love about the MikroTik devices as much is the fact that I'm a pen tester at heart. I've done a lot of pen testing, and I've ripped through a lot of vulnerable MikroTik devices. Man, the amount of enterprise networks I've hacked into, I gotta just say, man, I've hacked into internet service providers where I could get access to downstream millions of customers, right, through MikroTik vulnerabilities. It's bad sometimes, their code and the vulnerability. So that's why I don't usually say to people, hey, just go with MikroTik. Like, it's the all be all solution, because they didn't impress me in the past. That's not to say they haven't changed since. I have not used MikroTik in a solid 4 years. So I cannot say what it looks like as of late. Maybe they've improved quite a bit. Also, there is a very steep learning curve for beginners, at least compared to the other solutions here, right? It's not to say there isn't like a GUI that you can't use and all that. Lastly, leaving on Ubiquiti. So Ubiquiti's kind of got this interesting middleman position of things, which is why I have the propensity to use it for my own home network. At the end of the day, while I love cybersecurity and technology, my role in my organization is mostly graduated to overseeing as like a chief information security officer, a chief operations officer. But Ubiquiti is fantastic, where you can buy equipment that's fairly inexpensive across the entire domain of firewalling, switching, wireless access points, fairly stable. I've never ripped apart an enterprise that had a bunch of vulnerable Ubiquiti equipment in it. That's not to say it's impossible or anything like that. But Again, it's not nearly as bad as like MikroTik. It is closed source. That's one of the quirky things. Also, they do try to kind of have people leverage their call home solution, which is to basically access your firewall from anywhere. It goes through their cloud, which I don't fully love, though you can turn that off, at least for right now. So folks who are very diligent about like the privacy quirks of certain businesses may not love that as much, right? But again, you can at least turn that off right now. Tons of great features. One of the cool things actually I love about Ubiquiti's, you can deploy honeypots on your own network and get notifications about like when somebody's doing like a ping sweep or port scanning, that kind of stuff. Or, you can create a honeypot that looks like it has like vulnerable MS SQL that's open on it or MySQL that's open on it. And you'll get notifications when malicious actors go to tear it apart. So that's kind of neat. And they have a lot of good controls. The devices also perform fairly well from a performance standpoint as well. So
one thing about those though, I use the Dream Machine at home too, and they're like perpetually out of stock. They are actually pretty tough to come by on Ubiquiti's legitimate site for a reasonable price. And but you can sign up and get an email alert when they do come in periodically, and it'll save you a lot because third parties scalp them on Amazon. And if you're going to go to Amazon for it, be prepared to spend $80 to $100 more for the same thing.
Even the managed switches are a couple hundred.
no, you can. They got some managed switches that are like $40. I got
Oh,
a couple.
really?
Yeah, dude, they get
Mhm.
super expensive with some of this stuff. I do kind of wonder where they cut some of the corners. So just calling that out there. There is never ever the concept of zero trust, by the way. Anyone who ever tries to sell zero trust, Dennis and I were talking about this earlier, right? Anyone who goes to sell you zero trust, you go, oh, okay. So you're telling me that the hardware that's in my laptop, it's not trusted and whatnot, and that there's certainly never any possible backdoors in it. Anyways, that's a tangent for another day. I'll take just a very brief moment to hit on a couple tips when it comes to building a firewall and routing solution. So first and foremost, most home routers don't support VLANs, right? And so you want to create for your lab segregated VLANs and subnets so that you can really simulate realistic environments, right? So, hey, an enterprise would usually have something like web servers on this VLAN, database servers on this VLAN, right? Or workstations on this VLAN and server infrastructure on this VLAN and network management on this VLAN, right? And when you go to jump from one VLAN to another in regards to, let's say, doing, I don't know, just an Nmap port scan or something like that, it has to go through and be inter-VLAN routed. It means that it has to be, that traffic is analyzed by an intrusion detection and prevention system, which means that if you want to build up your skills as a pen tester, you're going to have to get good at evasion techniques. By the way, call out for everybody. We have on the Cyber Judo training site here some fantastic Nmap tips and tricks that Travis put together, talking about obfuscating and evasion when it comes to doing discovery on enterprise networks with tools like Nmap. That being all noted, so if you want to improve your skills, you're going to have an intrusion detection prevention system that you're on your home network for you to play with and see, can you see yourself, right? Test it back and forth. But also for the matter of security, I certainly don't want to have like, my iPhone on the same network as my company workstation, on the same network as my home printer, as my virtualization lab where I'm doing simulated pen testing and ripping things apart. Very poor form. So I'll show you guys just a very brief snippet of my screen in my Ubiquiti environment as an example. So first and foremost, if you're setting up a firewall solution for yourself, stop using 192.168.0.0/16s, right? You're limiting yourself and your capabilities. Use a 10.0.0.0/8, and then you can subnet that down into a set of /24s for yourself. I always like to, because I am a simple person, use the same third octet as my VLAN ID. So for network management here, this is VLAN 1. Trusted work is VLAN 2, so on and so forth. And you can see that I've deployed out a set of honeypot IP addresses, although I should have made it more fun. I should have made it not only with .5, just to kind of, whoever is on my network, throw them for a spin, But you can see that you can easily deploy a bunch of honeypots out And then you can really do some fun stuff with setting up some very specific threat categories for yourself and protecting your home network and whatnot. But what's really great about this here is now you have an intrusion prevention system where you can set very specific granular rules, turn them on or turn them off, and then do a test. See if you can break into a virtual machine, a purposely vulnerable virtual machine that's behind that network IPS. Okay, no, you can't do it because it got blocked, got detected. So you can get a notification about that through your system log. So if I go to here and I go to threats, I can see, hey, look, your pen test box got detected right here, and it's here's the severity, and it's concerning. Hey, do you want to go block this, or do we want to allow this? Right. So I always find that this is a helpful solution for somebody who is trying to improve their cybersecurity skills, most particularly in the domain of pen testing. So continuing forward here, virtualization solutions. Like I said earlier, everyone's familiar with VirtualBox. It's a great step to start with, but you got to graduate beyond it if you're going to have a real lab, right? And Microsoft Hyper-V, not a bad solution. WSL, which basically runs on the engine of Hyper-V, that's all right, but there's some limitations with it. You can't deploy everything that you want. The customizations are a bit hampering there. And obviously, all of the Microsoft ecosystem is closed source. Ease of use for Hyper-V is a general moderate. It's not too bad. You can pick it up pretty quickly. When it comes to solutions that are open source, obviously VirtualBox is open source. Although, if you're going to do some cool things with VirtualBox, let's say you want to do USB redirection and USB 3.0 in particular, you'll have to install an extension pack, which is technically closed source. Not a big deal. You install that. By the way, just as a side tangent and tip, which is really neat. So did you know if you want to do Wi-Fi pen testing, but you want to do it through a virtual machine, that's possible? What you could do is get a little wireless network adapter, USB, right? Plug it into whatever solution is going to be your virtualization hypervisor, and then you can do USB redirection. VirtualBox supports it pretty well. It's fairly stable. The reason why I happen to know that is because I tested it recently, and I've done it with VMware ESXi in the past. Can you do it with Hyper-V? I'm not entirely certain. I haven't tried. Can you do it with WSL? Certainly not, because WSL is actually doing, I should have called this out more specifically in the cons. It's really, really terrible about WSL. Anything that you do that's a low layer network thing in WSL, the network stack is not its own independent network stack. So anything that requires a lot of, let's say, network and port address translation to be clear on, not going to happen very well. You want to leverage Nmap and Wireshark. You want to have a Metasploit listener on it. You'll have inconsistent results. That's what we've had the tendency of seeing in our own environments. Travis, is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, especially with Nmap. Sometimes it'll warn you that you don't have raw socket privilege and it's not going to be, reliable. Sometimes it won't tell you anything and it'll just be wrong. Don't use Nmap under WSL.
Yeah. So when it comes to other solutions, Proxmox. So my boy Dennis here, big open source guy, big Linux guy, loves QEMU and KVM. If you're a QEMU, KVM guy, that's fantastic. That's awesome. Proxmox is basically just based off of that, has a pretty web GUI, and then allows you to kind of manage things more like VMware vSphere, which is essentially being able to manage clusters of devices and manage a lot of virtual machines at scale. So fantastic solution, absolutely awesome. Couple limitations that Hyper-V, WSL, and Proxmox all share in common is importing OVAs is a pain in the butt. It's not that it's impossible or anything like that. It's just annoying, And so in Hyper-V, you got to open a PowerShell, and then you got to have to pull the OVA apart. And it's an open standard, Microsoft. Just support it already. Why do you got to be Microsoft all the time? Okay. Super. Scott's using Proxmox on his Dell 7060. Nice. So with Proxmox and KVM, you can take the OVAs and convert it into QCal files. That's what it uses by default. So it's not a problem. When I say, by the way, difficult, I'm not saying impossible for anybody. I just want to note that this content is for mostly a lot of folks getting in and started in cybersecurity. So comparatively, Proxmox, KVM, QEMU are a little bit more difficult to use compared to like your VirtualBox, your Hyper-V, that kind of stuff. And then that leads us
I will say for KVM, so I am a masochist, so I hate myself and I use the KVM command line tools instead of any sort of GUI. But that being said, the only thing that I dislike about KVM has some good things. For instance, you can do PCI redirection. You can pass through devices pretty easily. Well, I wouldn't say easily, but you can pass through devices. The one of the concerning things about KVM that I have found in a very in-depth usage of the platform, if you are using it from the command line and you're using command line tools to interact with it, or you're using a library specifically, there's not great documentation. Some concepts are a little confusing if you're coming from another platform. It's not clear on how to do everything. So while it is a great tool, I love KVM. I think the performance is great. I think even against ESXi, I think it wins out a little bit, not by much, but it wins out a little bit. I know I know it does win out a little bit from what I've heard.
I'm just gonna let you know that, right? You're gonna start to play more. No, so, and then by the way, so for I call this out just kind of down below here. So when it comes to, or actually just above right here. So when it comes to other solutions, there's tons of virtualization solutions that exist out there, and as well as virtualization management solutions. So for example, Proxmox kind of more like a virtualization management solution. It's, again, using the underlying KVM QEMU, right? Another great solution that I love is CloudStack. I'm a huge CloudStack guy, or used to be, right? I don't run CloudStack here at home anymore because I've become lame and I'm getting old, but it is a fantastic solution if you're a QEMU KVM person. Actually, CloudStack does have interfacing for things like Hyper-V as well, although I don't think that Hyper-V on Windows 10 and 11 supports it. So Windows 10 and 11 Hyper-V is different than Hyper-V on Windows Server in the sense of some of the capabilities and the functionality, just to call that out for folks. Now, Hyper-V, ESXi, Proxmox, those are all bare metal or near bare metal solutions. VirtualBox is not, right? So while it may leverage a lot of virtualization extensions, VirtualBox has terrible performance. When you talk about other solutions that might exist, like VMware Workstation, the reason why I don't feature VMware Workstation on here is because it kind of sits in like a weird in-between zone, like why someone would quite use it, at least for this particular purpose for these types of workloads, right? So VMware Workstation is absolutely awesome, but it's also kind of like, okay, you're paying money now for something that's not going to get as good of performance as like KVM, right, or Hyper-V, because it's not bare metal.
If I can also add, yeah. So there are two things. First off, I would say the only other con I would say with Hyper-V is there's networking. Sometimes there's networking troubles, depending. It's a little quirky with the network adapters, so you might run into issues there. But I do use Hyper-V on my computer. It's easier than having to go through and set up a VMware's Workstation or VirtualBox. And the other thing I would say is the Workstation. The problem that I have with Workstation is they don't support, at least when I used it last, they do not fully support 2 monitors, which is a problem because at one point in time I was working on an ultrasound firmware, and it required 2 displays, and I could not load it in Workstation because it did not allow you to manage the displays the way I wanted. So that was my only complaint with Workstation. You got to pay for it, as Christian said, and also it lacks some of the functionality that VirtualBox has in some cases. So
yeah. So continuing forward, that leaves us with VMware ESXi. So VMware ESXi is a little bit different than all these other solutions in the sense of, well, I guess it's more similar to Proxmox in the sense that you wouldn't usually run this on a regular workstation computer that you're using at the same time. You can't actually, right? Because it's going to be this big black screen for the most part, black and yellow actually. But anyways, VMware ESXi, bare metal, very high performing. One of the things that people actually, when they hear ESXi, they always think, wow, lots of money. Actually, VMware has free licensing for folks to use. ESXi is free. It's vSphere and vCenter that cost money, right? Which essentially all your ESXi virtualization hosts, to manage all those together and do orchestration and be able to vMotion one virtual machine to another virtual machine, having shared storage amongst from one virtualization host to another virtualization host, having shared storage between your virtualization hosts. That's all done and orchestrated through vSphere and vCenter, right? So ESXi, you can run it. It's got a web GUI, just like Proxmox. Actually, it's one of the cool differentiators about Proxmox and ESXi is that you can just log into a web GUI real quick, look at your virtual machines that are on there, your workloads, customize them, create vSwitches for yourself, right? Put your vSwitches to the appropriate VLANs that you have, all that kind of stuff, right? So absolutely fantastic in that regard. It's close to
ESXi.
Yeah.
If I can just say one more thing about ESXi. ESXi, great platform. I do agree. I used it for a period of time. It is great software. The only problem that you may find for those of you who are getting into it, they have in the latest versions dropped support for moderately recent CPU architectures, or rather releases. So they've moved on to only supporting more modern processors that have, I think it's AVX2 is the minimum requirement. So if you're using something like an old Dell that you've drudged up to be able to actually run stuff on, it's not going to work with the latest version of ESXi. You're going to have to pull an old release. And even then, that's not really great because of security issues that have come out since then. But just a note on that.
I will say, so I got a couple micro, or I got a couple super micros here. They're fairly old. I want to say they're about 5 years old. I got ESXi 8 running on them. They're champing along. Although it did give me a message say, hey, by the way, you're using TPM 1.2, by the way, brah. Be aware that that might be deprecated in the future. But yeah, so thank you for calling that out. So it's only expensive if you are going to, again, deploy this out at scale. A lot of features and functionality there in that regard. So all noted. What are the type of workloads, the type of things that you can deploy and run on these systems? So everyone's familiar with Kali Linux. Most people are familiar with Parrot Linux as well, which is basically kind of a more polished version of Kali Linux. It's a little bit easier to use, got some cool additional tools, a little bit more centric to a pen tester's workflow, although sometimes a bit buggier. Sometimes the packages and applications don't work as nicely. So it's a work in progress, but it's always worth a shot. Always great to play with. But
Better than Black Arch.
oh yeah, so I didn't even list Black Arch because of that, because I could never get Black Arch to really be functional. I could never shell a system in Black Arch quite well because my tools always broke for me. But that noted, other workloads. So we kind of classify these out to a couple different types of functions for you guys. So we'll go through the basics. I think most people here are probably generally familiar with Metasploitable, right? So Metasploitable 1, 2, and 3, right? Everyone knows, have fun with it, but it's still very much like a hack the box, right? It's not a good simulacrum to any small business or enterprise environment. It's good if you want to improve your skills, mostly with the fundamentals of things like Nmap and Metasploit, so on and so forth. What's more interesting is I would take my Metasploit instances, put it on another VLAN. So I got to get through now my intrusion prevention system, and I try to shell something. It should be relatively easy to shell with Metasploit, right? But now I have to figure out how to obfuscate that shell code or obfuscate that particular exploit. That's going to be a much more of a challenge, and it's going to teach you a lot more on things that you need to learn at the ground level. That being noted, Mike, you want to chime in on that?
On Metasploitable, is that what you said?
Yeah, well, what I was talking about in regards to rather than just doing Metasploitable straight, take Metasploitable, put it behind an IPS, right? This way,
Yes.
if you have to like obfuscate your code, right? Doing encoding of like your reverse shell payloads, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, no, it helps you learn to get around those things as well, and not just rely on the automation point of it. A lot of us starting off in pen testing, we fall into that trap of utilizing, tools, which is great, right? And scanning tools, Metasploit itself is great, but you also want to make sure that you're able to craft these things and to get around, as Christian said, of the IPS IDSs. Some of those things you can grab also, to Christian's point, around the Microsoft Evaluation Center as well, where you can download your own OVAs for like Windows Server, set up your own Active Directory, make sure you're playing with those type of things, and make it to where you can actually get in there, set it up, and then play with your own Active Directories, right? Make sure that it's secure. And if you want to mess around with it, do the scans. But as far as Metasploitable goes, that's right on point. That's exactly what I would do as well.
So one note for from an anonymous attendee: VMware Workstation shares memory much better than VirtualBox. Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, VMware Workstation is an absolutely fantastic solution comparatively, right? That being noted, I would say, don't throw away necessarily VMware Workstation or VirtualBox for folks that are even using Proxmox. And the reason being is this: is that there are now, for like Metasploitable 3, if we just kind of go to their GitHub real quick, it's not an OVA that you download. You actually have to build it, right? You're building it through basically a set of automation tools, right? Primarily Vagrant is being leveraged here, right? And so Vagrant is going to, through a set of deployment scripts that you launch, is going to build a virtual machine, prepare it in VirtualBox for you, and serve it up to you. So it's fresh. It's freshly configured just for you. And obviously you'll modify the Vagrant configuration file so that like the Active Directory domain details are different for something, all that kind of stuff. But and then you could take that OVA and then exploit it to your preferred hypervisor, that kind of stuff. You can get Vagrant to work with other virtualization solutions, but it depends on whoever is creating the Vagrant configuration files. Usually people tend to go towards VirtualBox or VMware Workstation when doing that. Also, so Metasploitable 3 is very different from Metasploitable 2, especially because it allows you to build vulnerable Windows workstations, when previously Metasploitable 2 and 1 were very centric to Linux-like things and Unix-like things. I'd be quite remiss if I didn't call out one of my personal favorites when working with Vagrant is Capsule Corp Pen Test. So Capsule Corp Pen Test is really fantastic because this is going to build out for you a Windows Active Directory environment with a couple servers and a workstation in there for you to then exploit, right? And then as well as an Ubuntu pen test setup if you want, or you can just kind of skip that one. You can just kind of comment that out of your Vagrant file. That noted, on top of it has the additional benefit that it's all Dragon Ball Z themed, okay? So I will drop this also in the chat for folks as a quick reference as well. So give me one quick second. Where's my chat window? I got too many monitors I have to jump between here.
While you're doing that, I'll say that one of the third one on the list there, OpenVAS, that is by far the easiest way to deploy OpenVAS is to just download their OVA, throw it into VirtualBox or whatever you're using, and you can be scanning in a couple minutes. Now you can get OpenVAS to work on Kali, but that's not how I want to spend an hour fucking around. It is so fast to do it this way. I put it in the chat.
Yeah. So if you ever need to do some quick and dirty network vulnerability scanning team, certainly OpenVAS is fantastic. And for any folks who don't know, essentially before Nessus became fully commercialized, it was actually open source. So OpenVAS is essentially the old version of Nessus that then became forked. So it's still, for the most part, open source. It's supported by a company called Greenbone. And the little OVA that you download from Greenbone has the latest OpenVAS scanner there. You can get an enterprise, what they call enterprise MVP feed. So for the latest vulnerability detection capabilities and tests, or not, you can use the open source feeds and the free feeds. But you could deploy it out in a couple of minutes rather than having to mess around with Kali Linux. Also, one of the challenges, obviously, with Kali Linux, as well as Parent Linux, is a lot of times they'll have dependencies and repositories that are a bit old that are no longer really leveraged. Like, for example, if I was going to tell somebody to deploy a MITRE Caldera, I would not do that with the repositories that are featured by default in Kali, unless I want a version of Caldera that's over 18 months old. Right. So that's the kind of same thing with OpenVAS there. By the way, pro tip, Travis, now that you mentioned it, I'll have to add a couple of these additional hyperlinks at the end here, team. So always make sure you come back to the Cyber Judo documentation, because we're always coming back and improving it, adding additional resources and whatnot. But Pimp My Kali. So
oh yeah, that's great.
Once you deploy out your Kali VM, get Pimp My Kali on it. It'll make your life a lot easier. It's up a lot of your tools for you. It's a lot less.
I'll post that in the chat.
Yeah.
They've got a whole one of the buttons on it. Like one of the options is fix in packet. You don't know that you need that until it just doesn't work.
So there's a lot of other vulnerability lab solutions here, as you guys can see. So OWASP, Go, Juice Shop, Damn Vulnerable, Linux, Chaoptrix. Those are fairly standard ones. Other things that you can do that are really intriguing and interesting, though. Hey, you want to get good at CTI? You want to get good at being a blue team cybersecurity architect, right? Build out a SIM. Waza is a fantastic solution. It's essentially a fork of originally OSSEC. It's built on top of Elk Stack, and it's absolutely fantastic for doing secure information event management, doing network intrusion detection. It's fantastic at doing host intrusion detection. You can have it evaluate the security and compliance scores of your network infrastructure and your endpoints on your network. And better yet, what you can also do is you can connect it up to cloud infrastructure. You got AWS, you got Azure. Yeah, they got plugins and connectors for it. So you can have a lot of fun with Wazan. They have an over that you can booyah, deploy, start funneling data in from your own network to it, play around with it. It's a fantastic solution that actually I consider even better than OSSEC, and I consider enterprise worthy. Security Onion, another great solution for security information event management, doing CTI work, collecting data, intrusion detection, classic one there. Cuckoo Sandbox for forensic analysis. This would be usually you have a virtual machine, and then you would install the Cuckoo Sandbox application and environment on there and use it particularly just for that set of features and functionality. The Hive, good honeypots for CTI. It's a fantastic solution there. Got Rimnux for forensic analysis, malware analysis as well. One that I do not hear people talk a lot about, it's not deployed as an OVA. You can deploy it essentially on a virtual machine that you build and you install the software afterwards, but GNS3. GNS3 allows you to build virtual network devices with different sets of configurations. You want to emulate an old, Cisco 1800 series ISR or ASA or some ancient Juniper device. You could do a lot of that in GNS3. And then you can have those devices get tested. So that's a great way if you want to build up your skills, but not necessarily have a billion ancient pieces of networking equipment sitting in your office or your basement, eating a bunch of electricity up. So I know we covered a lot of ground here, and I just want to double check any big questions or concerns. Okay, so what about UTM open source firewalls, physical, virtual, and enterprise level protections? UTM. Are we talking about Sophos UTM? What about UTM? Also interested in creating mini enterprise lab with Blue Team Security Onion, deep packed with, and Waza. Yeah, Waza's really great. Yeah, the dashboards and Waza, they require a little bit of component experience sometimes to polish up and whatnot. Assuming you're talking about Sophos UTM, Sophos, they moved away from doing a lot of work on UTM for their XG firewalls. I really loved Sophos UTM back in the day. It was very utilitarian, very effective. But I may be misunderstanding. I don't remember Sophos UTM being completely open source though. So any other good questions? I want to open up to comments from the rest of the fantastic panelists we have on here tonight. Dennis, Mike, Travis, you gents have any additional items you want to add in here from a high level for folks before we jump off?
It can definitely be intimidating when you're first starting to look at it, especially if the first thing you look at is like a VMware course on YouTube and you're like, what the hell is vSphere? Do I need a vSphere? No, it can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. And I was just do something simple at first to get your feet wet, and then progressively build it out as you get a little bit more comfortable with it. Building up and tearing down these different lab environments, changing them up, trying to do different things, just in creating them is going to teach you a whole lot, like Christian said in the beginning, even as much as really playing around in them at first. So try all the different solutions, at least all the open source ones. I'm not saying buy all that thousands of dollars of equipment, but yeah, give the free license of VMware a shot, give Hyper-V a shot, give VirtualBox a shot. You can use more than one in different ways. Just a way to get exposed to different kinds of different kinds of the technologies, because I certainly use all three of those and WSL pretty much every day. So the more you can get yourself exposed to, the better off you're going to be in general.
Great point
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, and you know what, while you're doing these things, you know, especially for some of the web app things that are up here, like, you know, OWASP, Jupe Shop, DBDBA, WebGoat, all those things, make sure you're also doing your own reports on them as well, right? Get that skill started early, because a good report is what will separate a pen tester from just the regular guy in the crowd, right? So make sure you're doing those things as well. It's super important to be multifaceted with reporting.
Hey, thanks for calling that out. Hey, more self-promotion over here, team. By the way, all the cyber judo stuff that we do here, team, we don't run any ads, we don't sell any ebooks, we don't sell anything. Travis, myself, Dennis, Mike, who's been doing a fantastic amount to support us here. This is all just in our free time to help people get started cybersecurity and build up their skills, and because we're enthusiastic about it. So we have a lot of content about like writing a pen testing report and how to structure it and all the tips and whatnot. You know, even though we have day jobs as pen testers and whatnot, we want to spread this information to everyone else. Even if I have a competing firm who's on this call right now, like if their team can be better pen testers, that means that they can protect the world even better too. And if they have something that I can learn too, great. That's awesome. We're all on the same team in that regard, right? That all being noted, I really like the note that you provided there, Travis, that again, this is about not a, hey, let's just do this one thing. Hey, let's set up OpenVOS. Oh, hey, let's just set up Hyper-V, and you don't understand the why, and you don't understand the options behind it. You don't understand the pros and cons, what you're getting yourself into. This is really about understanding the smorgasbord of opportunities that await you, right? And being able to evaluate, hey, right now, this is what I can do with my budget and with my skill set. I'm going to try this out. And then next year or in 6 months from now, I'm going to do this. I'm going to grow it. I'm going to scale it, right? It's all about the mindset in that regard and knowing what's at your fingertips in that regard. Got a note about the Sophos stuff here. So yeah, so anything comparable to Sophos UTMs, honestly, you know, so I haven't worked with the enterprise licensing for PSense. Back in the day, it's been probably a solid 2 years since I've worked with PSense. They had it where it was only like PSense Gold, they called it at the time, for like support and whatnot. So I don't know if they've now put certain features behind a wall. I would hope not. That would be really in poor form of them, but unfortunately organizations tend to have that juncture where they move towards that direction. But PSense was, I mean, I was using it in enterprise capacity for many, many years, and it was fantastic. You can run it on x86 hardware. It doesn't perform as well because it doesn't have ASICs and that kind of stuff. But I would say that that's a pretty cost-effective enterprise solution. I would also say I mean, guess when we talk about enterprise, what does someone really mean? I mean, like a business is probably less than 200 users, I think can be supported by the Sophos XGs. I think they could be well supported with PSSense. I think they could be also well supported with the Ubiquities. Probably once you start to get north of the territory of 200 users, that's when I would start to honestly start to recommend things like Palo Altos to people, Cisco Meraki's, that kind of stuff, because there's a certain element of just actual support that you might need in case the hardware dies and that kind of stuff. And I will say, I have never, ever ripped apart a well-configured Cisco Meraki network. And I've never been able to shell a Cisco Meraki appliance, although it's on my bucket list. So that being
I have so many Meraki MR34s, Christian, and they're just waiting to be to have their firmware hacked.
There'll have to be a future here.
But just one quick note as well, before we get off here, I wanted to say for the Hyper-V, one note on Hyper-V. If you are using Hyper-V and you are running a Windows host inside of Hyper-V or anything inside of Hyper-V that is going to use nested virtualization, your host machine has to be a Pro or Server edition of Windows. If you try and do nested virtualization for Hyper-V on a home box, it is not going to work. I learned that the hard way. Don't make my mistake.
Also, but you could do nested virtualization on ESXi for free. Okay. And then follow up here. So next gen firewall IPS detections. I mean, most hooks are used Snort. And so I remember Snort being in PSSense, and it's probably similar in Cisco. Actually, intrusion prevention and intrusion detection systems can only still get you so far. There's a lot of evasion techniques to kind of like walk around them and whatnot. Usually what we would suggest to folks is you have to have compensating layers to your cybersecurity defense in depth approach, like having honeypots laid in across the network infrastructure. Like one of the things that no intrusion prevention system ever picks up is net BIOS poisoning. Net BIOS poisoning is probably the #1 way to do lateral movement and gain access to Windows networks, right? If you got Windows workstations and servers and you have not disabled link local multicast name resolution and net BIOS, I will tell you what, you are asking for a hacker to rip apart your environment in one night, okay? But you want to know what? No intrusion detection system or prevention system by default looks for that. Security information event management solutions like Alien Vault now do. I think Wazaa has an agent for it that you can deploy out now too, but you have to deploy it to every VLAN and subnet because NetBIOS and LMNR are layer 2 protocols. So it's always broadcast within that particular network VLAN. So certainly when we talk about next generation IPS, I still only give that like only so much salt there. So that being noted, yes, you can install Hyper-V on Windows 11. You just can't do nested virtualization within it. And there are some limitations in regards to like, you can't have it interface with other Hyper-V clusters, and you can't like move a virtual machine from one Windows 11 Hyper-V instance to another one.
Yeah.
So
as far as nested virtualization, that's WSL specifically in that case, just to point that out. So if you try to do WSL inside a VM, it's not going to work if you have a Windows 11 or Windows 10 home edition PC.
Cool beans. So I know we're just about at time here. Team, everyone, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolute pleasure. I believe our next Cyber Judo session is going to be coming up next week, is going to be a little bit more focused towards mobile application security testing and mobile application pen testing. Particularly, I believe Shane, my brother, is going to be joining us to start ripping apart some Android APKs and reverse engineering those. So that'll be really fun. So stay tuned on LinkedIn. We'll post up a LinkedIn invite for that in the next couple of days. And again, we hope everyone has a fantastic night. Thank you. Bye now.
Take care.